Picture the scene. Angels present themselves before God, and Satan comes along with them. Satan, the accuser, is confronted by God. "Where have you come from?" Satan replies to God and says he's been roaming the earth. That's what an accuser does. He roams around looking for someone to accuse. And then the scene turns. God asks Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on this earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil." Job 1:8. Now, that's quite interesting. The accuser, Satan, is in the presence of God and the angels, and God gives Satan something to do. I like to think of this as some good old heavenly smack talk by God towards Satan, because God is basically saying, "Have you considered trying to accuse and tempt my servant Job? He's so good and so committed to me that I don't think you can cause him to curse me." Satan was told that he had permission to do whatever he wanted with everything that was Job's. He just couldn't harm Job himself. Kids gone, livestock gone, servants gone. Job didn't curse God. Satan becomes frustrated and asks God for permission to harm Job physically. God grants his request, but demands Satan to spare his life. Job becomes covered with boils. Job and his 3 friends have been going back and forth as to why he's suffering. Each friend has an explanation. Job has a response for each of them, and the back and forth goes on between them. Job continues to wonder, "Why am I going through this?" Once all the back and forth has gone around and around, God decides to speak up. God begins in chapter 38 and following to take Job to task. He shows Job that he has no idea the depths and power and wisdom and sovereignty of God for him to demand an answer from God for the reason for his suffering. Point after point after point, God shows Job that he has no right to be upset over the fact that he hasn't given him a reason for the suffering he is experiencing. Instead of Job asking why, God wanted him to simply trust him through the suffering. James E. Smith makes this very point. By not directly answering Job's questions about suffering, God is saying the issue is beyond human comprehension. Rather, the believer should view suffering as a test of trust. Now, this is a really interesting response by God to Job. After all, Job didn't curse God. He simply asked why. But it is in God's response to Job that we see something we can never forget. None of us would blame Job for asking God why, but God does. Our puny little perspectives can trick us into thinking that we somehow deserve to have a reason for everything we experience. Not so, says God. There are some things that we wouldn't understand even if those things were revealed to us. Our brains don't measure up. And Job realizes this. He realizes that while he has suffered greatly, God is still gracious enough to engage with him, and God is still on the throne. And so he repents and apologizes to God. "I had heard reports about you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I reject my words and am sorry for them. I am dust and ashes." Job 42, 5-6. Job shows us that our worship doesn't have a prerequisite of good circumstances. He shows us that even the best of us are too messy to understand fully God's will and God's ways. He was a righteous man. He was a good man, but he still had to come to terms with his smallness before God. Is it possible to have a level of trust in God that would allow us to get through even the greatest suffering while continuing to believe that he is good? Maybe. What we can see in Job's life is that he had friends who didn't help the matter. It could be that by surrounding ourselves with godly individuals who we are open and honest with would help greatly in this endeavor. But if you read the book of Job yourself, you'll see that Job likely held it together for longer than most of us would. Most of us would have cursed God as soon as all this went down. But if there is any hope from Job, it's that God has a purpose in our pain. He doesn't cause it, but he can work in it. And it was through Job's pain that he learned what it looked like to trust God through thick and thin. So when all hell breaks loose in your life, will you look to God as your anchor in the storm? Will you turn to godly people who will speak life into you and your situation?